Welcome to the Chess Angle. This is not your typical chess podcast. If you're an amateur or club-level player, the Chess Angle is for you. Our content is aimed at busy adults who are serious about the game but have limited study time. Featured guests include both amateur and titled players alike. And now, here's your host, Director of the Long Island Chess Club, Neil Bellon.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. My guest this week is English Grandmaster Daniel Gormally. Daniel is a professional chess player and coach who has written several books on the game, including Mating the Castled King and Epidemic, A Journey Through the World of Chess Improvement, both of which we'll be discussing today. He is also the author of a 3-part Chessable series entitled Sharp Middlegames. In addition, Daniel has represented England in the European Team Championship and is a 2-time winner of the English Rapid Play Championship. He earned his final GM norm in 2005 in a tournament in Gibraltar, where he scored a 2693 performance rating. So, Danny, good to see you, and welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on there. I was really appreciate it.
Absolutely, my pleasure. So I figured we would start out discussing the state of English chess. We're obviously based in the States here in New York, so a lot of listeners may not be familiar. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the state of the English chess scene and how you feel it can be improved.
Yeah, I mean, I did a number of videos or comments on, I post a lot on Facebook as well, and also articles talking about English chess and why it's declined. In my opinion, it's declined. But it's also, I think, a wider reflection of the chess scene. And although chess has obviously become far more popular because of the pandemic, it's also struggling to get sponsorship, particularly for over-the-board tournaments. So that has been reflected in English chess. But one of the things I tended to repeat a lot was the fact that, English weekend tournaments, for example, where you normally typically play a game on the Friday, and then you play 2 games on the Saturday and then 2 games on the Sunday. The prize money in those events have declined. And obviously the cost of everything else has got a lot higher. So, for example, if I go away to play tournaments, the train tickets now are very, very expensive. So just to give you an example, obviously I live in Northumberland, and I played in the British Championships a couple of years ago in Torquay. I got the train down, and when I got to the ticket office, I said, well, how much is the train? Because this was like before 9 a.m. in the morning. So it's quite a long journey because you're going out to Torquay, which is in Devon. And he said it was 550 quid. I was like, well, that's crazy, right? So he got it down to 250, but then you start to see the cost of everything. And obviously you've got the hotel as well. If the prize money in these tournaments is only about £300 or £400, then obviously, you're going to get eaten up by all the other costs.
Yeah, right. So it's just very expensive now, these tournaments, for, I guess, professionals and amateurs alike.
Exactly. It's very expensive, and it's getting to the point where it's almost become too expensive. I do think that English chess has declined in the sense that we don't have a very strong presence in a lot of over-the-board tournaments. For example, the recent FIDE World Cup, we hardly had any participants. If you go back sort of 30 years ago, like 1990s, we had a number of, we had people like Sadler, Adams, Schultz, Hodgson, obviously, and that continued with people like David Howe, Luke McShane. So I think where England had a lot of success was that we had a lot of lone wolf type players like Tony Miles and John Spielman, Nigel Short, and so on, who essentially became self-made grandmasters and had a lot of success. Which worked, that worked for a long period because we had a huge talent pool. But unfortunately, the talent pool dried up. And obviously, the money has also dried up in English chess, which discourages people from becoming chess professionals, essentially, and So any promising young player, they decide, look, I don't really want to go into chess. The money in chess is rubbish. I'm going away to these weekend congresses. First prize is £300. I can sit at home and make more money than that online. What's the point, right?
Do you think, as far as the attendance at some of these OTB tournaments, you spoke about the cost. I mean, do you think there are other factors as well that may be causing the decline?
Yeah, I think partly it's the competition with over the board chess is partly a problem because online chess, because online chess obviously, Neil, has become hugely popular. So therefore, it's almost more enjoyable to sit at home and play on chess.com or play on Lee Chess. It's much easier and it's much less expensive. I mean, there's nothing that really replaces over the board chess. The kind of thrill. I mean, the thrill that I've got in the past from winning games over the board. It feels, the psychology that's involved and everything is huge. But yeah, there's a lot more competition, and not just from chess itself, but also from other sources. So, for example, there's a lot of stuff online now that you can watch, not just connected to chess. There's Netflix now. You didn't have Netflix back in the day. You only had four television channels. Now you have so many different entertainment sources luring you in. Therefore, chess itself might not seem so popular.
Yeah, you basically have a computer screen that is the ultimate entertainment center. I mean, like you said, there's Netflix, there's Disney Plus, there's Amazon Prime, there's YouTube, there's all these different things that I guess prevent you from leaving the house. See, I find here in the States with online chess, it goes in one direction or the other. The one direction is what you mentioned, which is people play online. They're like, why should I leave the house? This is great, because it does take, if you're working, say, a conventional day job, it is a lot of effort and a serious conscious commitment to play over the board. But to simply just play on your phone or at home on your couch, it's so much easier. But then you also have the other side of it, which is people like myself and others at our club, which is online chess is great, but it's not quite enough. It's like you said, it doesn't quite replace the thrill of over the board play. I know for me, online chess is like a completely different game, completely different animal. And it's almost hard for me to kind of get the same mindset when I play online as when I do over the board. I know, do you find that for yourself? Because I feel for some people, they can kind of treat it all as one in the same, but for me, it's two totally different games. Would you agree there?
Yeah, I mean, actually, an interesting anecdote was I played online leagues. There's a Four Nations Chess League in England, which is like the strong over the board. Obviously, that got shut down during the pandemic, like a lot of things got shut down. So somebody had the idea, why don't we do an online 4NCL? So I started playing online 4NCL. And obviously, you're sitting at home and you're playing against some quite decent players, actually. I remember beating Gawain Jones, but I was in this kind of mode where I was playing a lot of 1 minute chess at the time. So I played very, very quickly against him, which might have seemed suspicious to him because I was playing so fast. And I managed to beat him. He's obviously a very strong player, he's over 2,600. But then I tried the same thing against Jack Rudd, who's also a very quick player. And I actually got a winning position, but then I blundered. And then I resigned immediately, even though the position was drawn. So I'd gone from like winning to drawn, and then I just resigned in a drawn position, which is ridiculous. But because I didn't bother, because I blundered, I was so annoyed by that. I just resigned. I thought, well, you wouldn't do that over the board because you take it a lot more seriously. But online, it somehow doesn't seem very serious. And I found during those games, because they were at a longer time control, because it was classical online chess, I would have the TV on in the background and I wouldn't really be focused on the game itself. As far as Blitz is concerned, obviously that's a different thing, but Blitz is very, it's almost like a temporary fix when you play online Blitz. You're getting a temporary kind of buzz. It's like people who play online poker. I think you're getting an online fix, but you're not necessarily, you don't get that kind of enjoyment, I think, sort of like almost spiritual enjoyment, I think, sometimes when you play over the board games, or if you win an over the board game, you play a great over the board game. You don't get that with online play, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of, computers and online chess, couple of questions about that, because this is a big issue now. Do you feel chess is becoming played out because of AI and computers? Like, what are your thoughts? Are engines killing the game? Curious about your philosophy about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Neil. I mean, obviously, when I first got into chess, uh, just to give you kind of a boring kind of or a biography of my experience with chess computers. Obviously, there wasn't that many computers, but they were still quite strong. You had Fritz, um, and when I used to go to a local chess club, and I kind of stagnated. Actually, I wasn't really a good junior. I didn't really play much junior chess, and I played. There were about two or three people in the local chess club at Charlton Chess Club, was in Southeast London. They were quite a lot better than me. And so what I did is I actually brought a chess computer, or we got a chess computer, and I played against it a lot. And my tactics went through the roof because of the simulation from the chess computer. And I started beating these people down the club. So then you started thinking, well, actually, chess computers are really, really powerful, because this has actually led to my huge improvement. That's led to kind of my jump to get to GM. But as far as computers solving chess, yeah, I think that is a worry, because I find that now when you're sitting at home and you're analyzing, particularly if you're analyzing an opening, and you're preparing for a specific opponent, it's very hard not to turn the engine on and actually use your own brain. And yeah, this is one of the things that I've struggled with as well in regards to writing as well. I do a lot of writing articles and stuff, and it's very hard to write about openings without referring to the engine, because the engine is sort of like saying, well, look, it's seen everything essentially. But yeah, this is a problem that I had that, maybe we can discuss, which is an issue where my analysis levels broke down essentially because of using computers too much.
Well, when you say, I want to follow up on a couple of things. Well, let's take what you just said. When you say your analysis sort of broke down from the engine, could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so what I was doing, I was using this is probably going back about maybe 10 years or so, because I kind of went through a wilderness period. I played for England, things didn't work out, my rating dropped down. And obviously you're kind of in a wilderness in a sense. I've already got the GM title. What is my aim? And I think that's why I kind of went through the motions for many years. I wasn't really doing a lot of work on chess. I was kind of like just going through the motions. I don't remember studying really hard. I should have really been going after it. I was in my 30s at the time. It's a great period to play chess. You're kind of at your peak at that time, and I wasn't really attacking it. And what I tend to do was I'd had a lot of computer programs on various computers, chess engines on various computers over the years. Some of them like Houdini, Komodo, stuff like that. And I would just, whenever I got stuck on a position, I would turn on the engine, and I would get to the point where I actually stopped analyzing. I'm a GM, obviously you should be able to analyze, but I just didn't know how to analyze anymore because I wasn't used to analyzing. And I think that's a very important point, that you can overuse computers. Whenever you get stuck on a position, it's very easy to get frustrated and think, well, what does a computer think here? You turn on the engine, it immediately tells you the correct answer. But where's your involvement? You haven't had any input yourself. It's just a computer. When you get stuck on a position in an actual game, you're not going to have the recourse to turn on the engine.
For those of us at the amateur level, do you feel that that's true as well? Because I know personally, I use an engine a lot. I think it helps. I try to obviously analyze myself, but it does help. Do you feel like, to what extent do you feel amateur players should or should not use an engine to review their own games?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example. Like a coach, student who's quite promising, a young kid. And every time we analyze, he's already analyzed the game with his engine, which is great. But then I'm thinking, whenever he's finished the game, he'll immediately look for the game of the engine, which is very, very true of most younger players and probably most adult players as well, is that the first recourse is to turn on your phone or turn on your computer, stick the game through. The computer's immediately telling you, well, you went wrong here, but you're not really learning from that. I found it interesting when I heard from this Mishra, and he was talking on one of these video interviews, and he said generally after his games, he will analyze the game himself. And only later, once he's done his analysis, will he go through it with an engine, which is much better way of doing it, of course. But I think most people don't have the patience to do that, because you immediately want to know. It's almost like a kind of, like a dramatic thing, or like a kind of, what actually happened in my game? Why did I go wrong? But it doesn't really help you improve, I don't think.
I know for me, like when I look at an engine, I mean, I admit I'm guilty of that. I'll go to the engine, but I try to at least be very thorough. I don't try to just look at gross blunders or, tactical shots I may have missed. I try to look through the game at least a little more thoroughly. I think what a lot of amateurs do is kind of what you said. They look at it very superficially. Okay, well, I went wrong on move 4 and move 10. Let me move on with my day. Whereas if I look at one of my games, I'll say, okay, I messed up on move 4 and move 10, but still look at the whole game. Look at the themes, the tactics. So I think that helps a little bit. I agree with you about the engine. It can be, but I think a lot of it is how you use the engine. I think if you use it responsibly, I think can be very helpful. But if you use it very superficially, then I agree there's not much learning taking place.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things I noticed, actually, I played Hastings recently, and one of the things I noticed was I was chatting with a friend of mine, Jonathan Hawkins, and he mentioned a game, and he went quite deeply into it. And I thought, well, actually, if you're going to use the engine, what you should do is go very deeply into it. Go really try to understand why it's saying those lines, or really, it can really open your mind up as well. So it can be very useful when you analyze with an engine. But I think if you just do it superficially and you kind of skimp through, it's not really giving you a kind of a broader outlook. So I think if you're going to use the engine, use it kind of fleetingly, but also if you do use it in a very kind of deep way and try to really get into the nitty-gritty of the game and really into the finer points of the position.
Danny, I want to explore one other thing you mentioned. You said at the top of this segment that when you used an engine, your tactics skyrocketed, like your tactical prowess. Was that simply from analyzing your games and looking at tactics, or were you using the engine to do actual tactical puzzles? Like, can you specifically explain how using the engine helped your tactics skyrocket? I find that an interesting point.
Yeah. Well, what I had was I had a Nigel Short SideTac computer. So I had quite a few chess computers which you could actually play over the board with. There weren't like computers there weren't engines that were actually on the computer. I didn't really have a laptop at that point. This is kind of like, we're talking about like the early to mid 1990s. And there were also computers like Mephisto. You could have Mephisto computers, and some of them played actually in weekend tournaments in England and so on. But I would play against it. And I noticed it would often repeat the same game. It would sort of like, it would play like, so you'd crush it in an English opening, for example, which you can never do now. Like back in the day, you could strategically wrap them up. You would go like C4 and they go E5, and then you go knight C3, and eventually you go G3, bishop G2, E4, D3, H3, F4, F5, and they wouldn't know how to defend against it. And then I'd repeat the same game, right?
Yeah.
I repeat the same game. But there were other games where I'm noticing the tactics, and I was like, wow, this is really opening my mind up to what's possible. So effectively, it wasn't from analyzing, but it was more from playing. I was just playing. And one of the things I noticed actually was that somebody mentioned this recently. Actually, it was somebody I know called Tom Villiers, and he mentioned that he worked with Mikhail Gurevich. who back in the day was one of the best chess players. And he trained, I think he was world number 3 at one point. He trained people like Karpov and Kasparov. And he also trained Anand. And apparently one of his stories was that Anand, he was one of the first people that was introduced to Fritz by Frederick Friedel. And he went over to Germany, he was playing against Fritz. And he would just play against Fritz. He'd play like hundreds or thousands of games against a computer. And that kind of assimilated into his mind. It kind of absorbed into his mind. And he would then, that's why he went on this long winning streak, like in the sort of early 1990s. He would just like win all these tournaments. He got up to world number 2 behind Kasparov. He's one of the greatest players in the world. And that was a lot of that was down to just playing a lot against the engine. So I think that's actually something that people underestimate. I mean, people work a lot with engines and they analyze their games with engines. They don't really play with engines much, right?
That's interesting, the distinction between playing against an engine and analyzing. Well, Hikaru credits that, right? Didn't Hikaru play against the computer quite a bit as part of his growth? I believe he spoke about.
Yeah.
I mean, I think a number of people have said that. So, all right, moving on from there, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the current cheating epidemic in chess, which, it's giving the game a lot of attention, but obviously for not good reasons. But I'm just wondering what your take is on this whole thing. I'll let you run with that however you will.
Yeah, it's an awkward one because, there was a game the other day where Kramnik was playing against a 14-year-old online, and Kramnik was streaming this game live, and Kramnik lost the game. He was black. He sacrificed a piece for what looked like a reasonably promising attack. His opponent refuted the attack quite immaculately, it seemed like, and he won the game. Now, on Reddit and so on, a lot of people are saying, well, Kramnik's paranoid, blah, blah, blah. But the thing is, I think this is one of the things that differentiates people. With someone like Kramnik, he's played a lot against computers. This is what I was saying just now. He's played a lot against computers. He's trained against computers. He played a match against computers, a very well-publicized match, Brains in Bahrain. And so he understands when something's not quite right. So people say, well, Kramnik's paranoid, and say, well, I think you also have to respect the fact that he's one of the best players in the world, has been for many, many years. He's one of the best players ever, probably, right? And you can't just dismiss his faults. I mean, no disrespect to people on Reddit, but a lot of them don't play at that level. They haven't analysed the computers to that degree. I think you do get a feeling for it. On the other hand, you've got to say, realistically, that's not the same as, defaulting someone with an algorithm. Now, what Kramnik argues is that he says that there's a lot of money coming into chess now, into the online side of the game, which is true. And the theory is that because there's a lot of money coming in, a lot of the methods that they have to detect cheats are a little bit old-fashioned or a little bit behind the times. And I actually agree with that. I think what they should do is update their methods. I was saying this the other day. I think if you're going to have big money tournaments, like stuff like online Title Tuesday, which at the end of the day, they're paying out a lot of money over the course of a year. What they should do, in my opinion, is they should have people going into people's homes, the regular winners on Title Tuesday, because there's this whole thing now about we don't know who the cheaters are. There's somebody, Caruana has alluded to this. Kramnik has alluded to this. There's quite a few people who alluded to this, that we don't know who the cheaters are, but we think that some people are cheating. Well, why don't you how much does it cost, chess.com, to send people round people's houses? There's one thing having them on the Zoom call, but if you're having them on a Zoom call, that's not necessarily going to stop them from cheating. So if you're having them on a Zoom call, but if you have somebody around somebody's house viewing their screen while they're playing, I know that's awkward, that's uncomfortable, but at the end of the day, they're paying out a lot of money. I think that they should think about investing or becoming stricter about the whole rules. I mean, the problem is, Neil, that if you started putting the whole of Title Tuesday on Zoom, for example, then you'd have an issue where a lot less people would want to play it. So they've got to kind of juggle that kind of commercial side of it with, on the other hand, do they want to be like more strict about cheating? Because I do agree that I think there is a lot of cheating that's going on that we're not aware of. And how do you deal with that?
Are you dealing with cheating yourself? Like, have you experienced it in the UK in your own circle, in your own games, whether online or over the board?
Yeah, there hasn't any games where I've been I've caught the person in the act, so to speak. But I remember playing a weekend congress several years ago, and my opponent crushed me in about 17 moves. He'd already beaten me in another tournament, and he got up from the boards. And after almost every move that he played, he would jump up from the board. This is some kind of businessman. So it seemed like he was going out to take a phone call. So I didn't really say anything at the time. Now, if I played that game, knowing what I know, I would probably say something. There are some people who will go to the extent of cheating over the board. I remember playing a game at the London Classic. I was suspicious of my opponent, but I didn't say anything at the time. That game ended in a draw, actually. But there were a few examples of games over the board. But it's generally, in my opinion, it's more of an issue with online. The people won't generally go to the length of cheating over the board. However, if people are going to that length, then you do wonder how they get away with it, how they're able to cheat over the board, because it's quite. The person that I've suspected of cheating in a tournament, they kept looking down. They were looking a bit shifty, and they kept looking down. So I wonder if they had some kind of device in their lap or something like that, right?
Yeah, and it puts you in an awkward position, because if you don't say something, it's like, I'm being, I'm getting screwed over somehow. This guy's cheating and I'm a victim. But yet if you say something, you don't want to sound like a bully, or maybe you're wrong and you don't want to sound like you're like, it's a difficult thing, because no matter how you handle it, you just feel, it's very, very awkward. But yeah, if you have someone getting up from the board all the time, checking his phone after every move, and like you said, that person beat you in 17 moves, that's not typical. Where, he was an amateur player, this businessman.
Well, no, he's quite a good player. But the thing is, I was like, at the time, my first reaction was, wow, I played really badly. But then when I looked at the game a bit more deeply, I thought, well, actually, somehow the cheaters, or like people who are cheating with computers, they somehow make it look like easy, right? Like when you play really well, like a lot of people use this excuse. Like when they're looking at that Kramnik game the other day, they were like, oh no, well, Kramnik played really badly. Yeah, but the guy made him look bad. And he made, like if you're cheating with an engine, you will make it look really simple. Example that I would give of over the board cheating was obviously a famous case was this guy, Igor Rousis, who was already an established chess professional for many years, but he started playing in smaller tournaments. And he was around about somewhere around about the high 2400s, and he was in his early 50s. And he started playing a lot of smaller tournaments in Europe, and he was always accumulating rating. He would never lose rating. He'd always either gain or at worst break even. So he'd probably draw with the stronger players. So he didn't want to elicit suspicion. So he'd draw with the stronger players, and then he'd pretty much wipe out all the weaker guys. But I felt like it was not improvement that was very likely. You're not going to improve that much, unfortunately. Obviously, I know a lot of your listeners are probably adult improvers and so on. But realistically, when you've been playing professional chess for 30 odd years, a bit like I have, or I'm almost 30 odd years now, you're not going to suddenly improve 150 points. It just doesn't happen, unfortunately.
Now, what do you think of, you've heard of the Ken Regan cheating algorithm, right? He's the cheat detection guy. See, I wonder about that, because as far as I'm concerned, and I'm just kind of spitballing here, this is all conjecture, it seems to me that if you use an engine just for like one particular move or one or two moves, I really am not sure if that's going to be. I mean, what do you think of his cheat detection thing? Because I'm not convinced that just because his algorithm didn't find cheating, that there's no cheating. I don't think it's foolproof. It might be a tool, but I don't put as much stock into that as some people. Well, like, what are your thoughts on that whole Ken Regan, algorithm, that whole cheat detection system he has set up?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point actually that you make because a lot of time you're right. He won't, or the algorithms won't ping people. This is the argument that people are making about Title Tuesday and other tournaments, is that there are people who are smart cheating. Now, I'm not sure about that because, in my opinion, I don't think it's as easy to smart cheat as you think. Like, are you really going to sit there with an engine and be that discerning that you're only going to bother looking at it for like 2 or 3 times a game? Or obviously, if you're like a top class player, then that's going to give you like a huge bonus over the course of several games. But it does seem a bit odd. I mean, let's say you're in a position where, it's about equal and you decide to ignore the engine, but, you might make a blunder, right? If you're smart cheating and you're deciding not to cheat without that engine, so you're taking that risk. So in my experience, most cheats will just generally cheat the whole game and then they'll ping on the algorithm. I mean, to give you an example, I had a friend who got pinged on chess.com and I sent their games to Ken Regan because they were like, they felt that they'd been unfairly accused by chess.com. So I sent their games to Ken Regan to analyze. He analyzed those games and he what he uses is kind of like a red, yellow, light system. So if their games if they're not cheating, then it'll be like a green light. If they're kind of like slightly suspicious, it'll be like an amber light. And if they're definitely cheating, it'll be like a red light, which is quite a good system, I think. And he said that they were kind of more like amber light. He felt that they were a little bit suspicious. So yeah, it's I think you do need people like Ken Regan. But on the other hand, I think as well, and what Kramnik and other people are alluding to is the idea that you possibly have these smart cheats. I don't know if that's true or not. You have these smart cheats. One of the things I noticed when I played on Title Tuesday, Neil, was people's level would go up a lot. So you play on a normal pool, and I'll be gaining points diligently the whole week. As soon as I go on Title Tuesday, I just collapse. People just playing out of their skins. So is that me being paranoid?
Right. No, it's not you being paranoid. Yeah. Interesting. All right. Good discussion on cheating there. So let's make a little bit of a right turn here. Let's talk about improvement. And I kind of want to ask you about adult improvement generally, Danny, and then maybe we can get into some of your content. So I'm going to ask a very general question, but I'll let you go with it as you see fit. I'll let you answer it, however you want to take it. So most of our listeners, most chess players generally are club players, quote unquote, adult improvers who have full-time jobs, who have families, responsibilities outside of chess, limited study time. What are your thoughts on how they can best improve at the game?
Yeah, it's difficult to improve, I think, when you get older because, it's obvious that I run a local school chess club, one of my local schools, and obviously the kids are just start improving, boom, boom, boom. It's much easier when you're younger to improve a lot, partly because you've got more time to dedicate to chess. When you get older, you don't have enough time. Partly, I don't know, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know, but I do feel that your brain is probably better able to absorb information when you're younger. But I don't think it's so easy to improve when you're older. However, I do think when you look at the certain ways you can improve, and obviously a lot of people go for stuff like they spend a lot of time doing puzzles. However, I read an interview recently with Ivan Sokolov, and he said when he was getting good, when he was improving, when he was younger, he'd spend a lot of time annotating games. So that would just get him thinking about games, just overall games. You're looking at the opening phase, you're looking at the middle game phase, you look at the end game phase. So he'd spend a lot of time analysing games, and that was really what got him good. And I do think that one of the problems that I see with amateur players that I work with is they don't annotate games. They don't annotate their own games. They don't analyze their own games. They either find it too difficult, or they're either too lazy, or they just don't, or they just not really consider the possibility of doing that. And they probably spend too much time playing pointless games online, playing Puzzle Rush far too often, and it's not really helping their chess. So I think analyzing your games, annotating your games, whether you do that in lead chess or whether you do that in chess space, it doesn't really matter. But if you don't spend that time annotating games, I don't think you're really going to improve.
Okay, let me ask you some specific questions. These are things that are sort of out there that, they, quote unquote, they say to do. I don't know who they is, but we'll call them the they. So one theory is, I'm just curious what your take is on this. One theory is, well, just do tactics, right? You're under 1800, you're under 1500. Just do tactics. Don't do anything else. Yes or no?
Well, no, I don't agree with that. But then again, I said before that one of the things that got me good was playing against a computer a lot. So maybe playing against a computer is something that amateur players could look into. It's a very easy thing to do.
So not just doing tactical puzzles, in other words.
But I would recommend doing studies. I think doing endgame studies can be very beneficial to training your calculation. I mean, things like Puzzle Rush do have a point. I do find that they sharpen up your tactics. I wouldn't dismiss that. I think there's many different ways to improve at chess. But yeah, I mean, going back to the whole playing against computers thing, you've essentially got an opponent that's stronger than Magnus Carlsen in your own living room, and yet you never bother to play against it. Well, I'm sorry, but that to me is like a big, it's a simple thing to do, right? Just play against a computer. It's probably going to help you to improve to some degree. But I think without the systematic analysis of your own games and possibly other people's games as well, I don't really realistically think you're going to improve.
How should amateurs treat openings? Are they spending too much time on it? Because that's another thing that's out there, right? Don't spend too much time on the opening. But what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, the whole opening thing is very interesting because actually somebody got in touch with me recently on Twitter, a guy called Strong Chess. I don't know if you're familiar with that guy.
Rings a bell.
It rings a bell. He's a guy who's into his gym stuff. And he said, you've got like the highest, he said to me, you've got the best score relative to your rating of anyone on lead chess. He was doing all these statistics. It was quite interesting. And it's another thing I think that people underestimate statistics as well. People don't look into statistical side. Are you playing openings that aren't really favoring you and so on? But he was talking about the fact that against the bishop b5 check Sicilian, I was scoring very well online. And I think the reason is when you go e4, c5, knight f3, d6, bishop b5 check, knight d7, which Garry Kasparov used to play a lot, and he also used to play the Najdorf, a lot of the positions end up looking like the Najdorf because often they'll go d4, you go c takes d4, they'll take with the queen, you go e5, so you get that Najdorf structure already. And one of the first books that I read, and it was around about the time I was doing this whole thing with a computer, I was playing against a computer a lot, was Danny King, book called Winning with the Najdorf. So it's one of the first chess books I read. And I really, spent a lot of time reading that book, studying that book when I was about 14 or 15. And so the Najdorf was one of the first chess openings that I really started to play a lot and got a lot of good results with it. So I think I played the Najdorf or certain positions in Najdorf to a very high standard, stronger than my rating. So what it made me realize was actually that I wish I'd spent as much time with studying other openings when I was younger. Because I think when you're older, it's harder to assimilate that information. However, what I should have done, even though I should have done that, I do think it also shows that if you buy chess opening books, that can also be beneficial as well. So I think I would actually, if you want to study openings, I would recommend try to find some good chess opening books, like Winning with a Night Off. That are probably going to really help you master that particular opening.
Okay, so what I'm hearing from you, playing against the computer is definitely beneficial. And as far as what to focus on, you really kind of do need to touch on everything, right? If you're an amateur, openings, middle games, end games, it's not really just because you hear these things, just focus on tactics, just focus on end games. You really kind of have to look at everything. Am I characterizing your belief correctly?
Yeah, I mean that's true. Yeah, I mean chess is quite a broad subject, isn't it? So it's like a lot of people have had a lot of success recently with Chessable,
Right.
which I think is quite a useful learning tool. And actually, I think I was one of the first people to do stuff with Chessable. But Chessable, you don't necessarily reflect how GMs learn chess or how masters level players. Most people learn chess, I think, through studying their games, flicking through. I mean, how I got good at chess, really. Obviously, you talked about the opening, but I also got good at chess through when I was younger. My parents used to buy the Evening Standard, so I look at the puzzle column in the Evening Standard. I go, well, how? I've spotted a tactic there. I've got that one right, and I would always get them right, And I didn't understand, I thought, well, I can't be that bad, right? Because this is a professional player writing these columns. So I think that, there's several ways to get good at chess, but as far as the openings are concerned, I think you can probably spend too much time studying the openings. But one of the things I noticed actually recently, one of the better tournaments I had over the last couple of years was a tournament where I remember going up to it. I was spending a lot of time working on the endgame side of chess because this is something that I've neglected over the course of my career, is endgame study. And during that tournament, I had a number of endgames. And normally I bungle these endgames, and I started to become more proficient at endgames. So I think that maybe technical side of the game, if you're like me and you're a very dynamic person, you're a little bit of a hyper person, probably drink too much caffeine. If you spend more time studying endgames, it might calm you down a little bit, and then you might become more chilled out. That's probably not a bad idea.
All right, so let's go to some of your content. I want to talk about that, especially Epidemic Shark, because I think that book is going to appeal to a lot of our listeners. But what I'll do, Danny, I'll kind of mention something that you've written, and then maybe you could talk about it, what it's about, what rating level it's designed for. So tell us about Mating the Castled King.
Yeah, that was a project. I think it was initially, I went to Quality Chess and said, look, I'd like to write a chess book. As usual, I don't have any money. Can you please sort me out with a project? So Jacob Agard had the idea. I think it was somebody else was doing it. I think he might have been called, he might have been a guy from Israel called Eli or something like that. And he was doing it originally. He was planned to do it with Andrew Gree. But they kind of backed out the project. So I took over the project. I started doing this book, Mating the Castle King. I felt like I learned some things from that book, from writing that book. For example, one of the things I noticed is when you go bishop e3 and queen d2 with black as fee and shattered kingside, the statistics were heavily favouring white if you managed to exchange the bishops, if you went bishop h6, which seemed to be the games that I analysed. Also, in situations where the king would get flushed out of its shelter and start running around the middle of the board, I noticed that you almost always wouldn't end well for the defending side. So these are certain things I noticed. But as far as writing books is concerned, I think the problem that I find, Neil, is that I think I've said everything I wanted to say, So it's almost got to the point now where I feel like, are you really ambitious if you just spend your whole life writing chess books? And if you're a talented writer, should you be trying to find a wider audience, if that makes sense?
Now, Epidemic Shark, and it's subtitled A Journey Through the World of Chess Improvement. I think a lot of our listeners are going to find this appealing because it really deals with the amateur player and the amateur thought process. So before we get into the content, Tell us why it was titled Pandemic Shark, a chess book.
I think I just came up with that idea because I was playing over the pandemic, and I noticed there was all these underrated players. And you played like 2100s, and they were really playing like 2300s, or you're playing like 1900s, and they were playing like 2200s. And you started to realize actually it's a completely different environment now, because it's true that when you play in over the board tournaments, and this has had an effect on my rating, this has had an effect on a lot of professional players. A lot of professional players are complaining about this. And is it because we're losing points because we're old and washed up? Or is it because we're losing points because these kids are like massively underrated and their ratings haven't caught up with the reality? It's probably a bit of both. But that was effectively what I was trying to reflect in the book. And I wrote it for Thinkers Publishing. I don't know if I should mention that I've also got another book coming out very shortly for them.
Sure, that's fine.
Which is called, I think it's something like Battle Manual. It's my own kind of tournament battle manual, which is giving amateur players an idea, appreciation, what it's like to play in professional tournaments. But effectively, it's just like, kind of like a comic look at what it's like to, which is a lot of what my writing has been, really. It's just like an honest kind of comic reflection of what it's like to play in weekend tournaments in England. And it's kind of a unique experience. I mean, most people, they spend their time working in offices, probably in quite boring environments. I'm getting a chance to travel around the country or travel around Europe or even further abroad, playing tournaments, which not many people get the opportunity to. And, I talked about how I played a tournament in quite near me, actually, in Newcastle. And I left the playing hall after the Friday night game. These couple kids came up to me and started sort of like, I thought they were going to mug me and all this kind of stuff. So you don't necessarily get that in normal chess books, I suppose. That would be my argument. But yeah, just going back to that Making the Castle King, actually, that actually got translated to Chinese, which I was quite proud of. So that bumped up the sales. But you tend to find now with chess books, Neil, it's hard to make serious money. I mean, the thing that I made the most money out of was actually was my Chessable course, the first Chessable course that I did.
The Sharp Middlegames, is that the one?
I was at a chess match in London. I was doing a simul at a chess club in London. I think it was like Battersea Chess Club. It was either Battersea or Hammersmith. And I ran into a guy called Liam Watson, who's a chess journalist. I said, look, Leon, I'm struggling to make money. I haven't got any cash. And he started talking about how he's working for this new company called Chessable, who I'd never heard of before he mentioned it. And he said, oh, yeah, they're doing stuff. Maybe you should have a word with them. So I got in touch with the guy who set up Chessable, one of the original owners or founders of Chessable, was a guy called David Cramberley. And I believe there's also John Bartholomew was involved right from the start. So I went down to David, where he lived in Swindon. I started filming this course called Sharp Middlegames. So it's quite funny because he had a small flat at the time, and his wife and his kid would go out for about a couple of hours. So I was only able to film the period where they were out. Once they came back, he had to kick me out again. But he wasn't very happy about the material that I'd filmed. So eventually I ended up filming it in the Netherlands. But it was very successful, and I made something like $20,000 out of that first course, which I was like, wow, this is amazing. Because normally for a chess book, you're only making maybe £3,000 or £4,000. So then I started thinking, well, actually, Chessable is like the route to go down. But then I discovered actually it's not as easy as you think. Right.
No, they're pretty, from what I've heard, Chessable, they're pretty demanding as far as their content and how they want to present it. Is that correct? Or
yeah, and the other problem I find now with Chessable, although I think they do very good courses, obviously, is that essentially they're oversaturated. So during the pandemic, they became massively popular. A lot of people started using Chessable. A lot of people who had never, were new to chess, they heard about Chessable. It was a growing company, so they brought in a lot of staff. But unfortunately, once the pandemic stopped, a lot of sales slowed down. And this was true of a lot of chess companies. They started to struggle. They didn't have the growth that they were expecting, so they had to cut back. And the other problem now with Chessable is that because, anything where you see like free money or like easy money, with chess players, everyone's going to jump on board, right? Because most chess players don't have any money. So everybody's jumping on board with the Chessable. And it's often strong grandmasters, 2,600 plus, who don't have much money themselves. And they're going, right, I'm going to do a course for Chessable. So if I approach Chessable and I say, look, I want to do this course, they say, well, actually, we've got X grandmaster wants to do it, and he's already rated 2,700 plus. But this other guy wants to do this other course that you've mentioned. He's 2,650. Where do I fit in? So it's actually become a much more competitive environment than when I first got into Chessable, unfortunately. But I think there is a lot of potential in that whole video production. I was speaking to a friend of mine called Brandon Clark, who he's got his own website. And he thinks a lot, there's no point writing courses on stuff like middle games and tactics and stuff. He thinks you should just do openings because people just buy opening courses.
It's funny you say that because I find that most amateurs are obsessed with openings. Even my own podcast, even if I'm just giving my own amateur take, all my episodes that are focused on openings, I see the highest download numbers. It's quite remarkable. So I think there's some truth to what you're saying.
Yeah, because I think the biggest problem that an amateur player has is the knowledge they have to accumulate. Chess is a knowledge game. They have a limited time to accumulate that. And I think, well, if I can't get past the opening phase, then, how am I going to get to the middle game and how am I get to the end game? And I do think it's very important to study the opening. That has to be something that you start with, really, is the opening phase. So, yeah, I think it's a very important point to make that people are obsessed with openings, but understandably so.
What I'd like to do now, Danny, is I want to end with one more segment. I want to talk about a few specific points you make in Pandemic Shark, some themes that are common mistakes among amateurs that I think the listeners will find instructive. So I'll just kind of mention it. You could talk about it. So you mentioned in the book about impatience and changing something into position when there's no need to, basically the chess version of if it's not broken, don't fix it. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I was talking about this book that I just finished, actually, which apparently is on release soon. Sorry to plug it again, but yeah, one of the things I noticed actually was my endgame knowledge was very poor. And for example, I didn't even know how to mate with knight and bishop versus king. Really, I'd never studied it. I dreaded getting it in a proper game. And so I actually started doing that. I started practicing it on Lichess. So in Lichess, you can set up the position and then practice that endgame, and also started practicing other endgames. Did rook and bishop versus rook. I was quite proud of the fact that I defended rook and bishop versus rook against the computer. So I think actually emphasizing the technical side really helped my chess, because then I went away and played that tournament and I won my first 6 games in a row. I ended up losing the last game, tied for first with the guy I lost to, was Mark Hebden, who's a very well-known, he's actually a very good technical player as well. But yeah, so I there's something that I think that people underestimate is the technical side of the game, that you should work on your end games a lot, because then you don't have to fear any phase of the game before that, because if you know that your end games are good, and you will get a lot of end games. People think that end games aren't irrelevant now because you don't get any end games, but I do think they're very relevant. But yeah, I do think that working on your end game skill is, and I think doing end game studies as well will help in that regard as well, because that will really kind of sharpen up your calculations. So yeah, I think that would be my answer to that, Neil.
You also, in the book, just kind of looking at it, you talk about overgeneralizing rather than concrete calculation, which I know that's a problem for me and a lot of players. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, one of the things I've noticed when I work with people, like any students who sort of get in contact with me, and normally they kind of, they get 1 or 2 lessons, they go, oh, sorry, I'll go somewhere else. But anyone who sticks, fair play. But yeah, I think as far as calculation is concerned, I'd say one of the biggest separators between professional players and amateur players is that professional players will generally start with the calculation. And it's kind of deceptive because when you see these commentaries, a lot of the commentary on stuff like YouTube and streaming stuff, a lot of it's dumbed down for the audience. So they don't really calculate in the way they would do in a proper game. Like GMs are kind of dumbing themselves down and kind of explaining, right, a knight goes here and they've got all these different names for the pieces and all that kind of stuff. So they're not really really showing what they're really capable of in a sense. But yeah, I think that as far as concrete calculation is concerned, I think that's a very important factor that you could work on is your concrete calculations. When I worked with amateur players, they'll start babbling a lot. They'll talk about the general features of the position. I'll say, well, look, what's the specific move? What is the concrete move? You've got to get used to understanding what a concrete move is. And when I play that move, what is my opponent's concrete reply? When I'm in bad form, I'll start forgetting about, I'll play a move and then I'll be like, oh, they played there. When I'm kind of rusty, and I find actually when I get older, Neil, that I'm more vulnerable to rust more than ever. It takes me a while to get warmed up, but I'll be sitting there and I'm thinking, right, okay, your next game, you got to think about your opponent's concrete replies, and you've also got to calculate checks and captures. You do the basics right. Sorry, just to go back once again to that thing we were talking about the patience. I think partly the reason I think people don't have patience when it comes to chess, and they try to change stuff too much. I think it's partly related to how they would train when they were a junior. When you're a junior, the first thing you learn is the four-move checkmate. So you learn about checkmate. You don't learn about moving around. You don't learn those kind of intricate, kind of sophisticated positional techniques. So I would recommend buying books like Mark Dvoretsky books, any kind of Russian kind of training kind of books, any kind of material like that. It kind of gets you thinking along the kind of positional side of chess. Let's talk about a technical side of chess. The book that I just about to be released, that talks about the end game, technical side of chess, and so on. So yeah, I think that is an important point to make. But yeah, I'm sorry, probably babbled on too much. But.
No, not at all. That's a great explanation because it's important. You have to look at actual moves and actual responses rather than just looking at it thematically or in a general sense.
Yeah, and I think I try to explain that when I'm talking. I mean, when I've done commentary work, I really do enjoy doing the commentary work. But then you do have to realize that a lot of the time people won't understand what you're talking about. But at the same time, yeah, I do think with amateur players, this is also why they need to annotate their games. And I think another reason why you need to annotate your games is you have to get used to evaluating positions. I remember teaching a friend of mine. He was the one who arranged the translation for Mate and Castle King. And I did a little bit of coaching with her. And I said, how do you evaluate this position? And she said she wasn't used to evaluating positions. It's something that never really occurred to her. And I said, you've got to get used to evaluating positions, because if you don't know how to evaluate a position, how will you know what you're calculating? What's the point of calculating a variation if you don't know how to evaluate the position at the end of it? So evaluating positions, I think, is also very important for amateur players, and if they can get used to that, used to annotating their games, used to analysing their games, then they should see some kind of improvement, in my opinion.
So I think I'm going to end it there. Excellent discussion. So Grandmaster Daniel Gormally, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Neil. Thanks for having me on, mate.
No, I appreciate it. A great discussion, a lot to think about. And for those of you at home, we really appreciate you listening, and I hope you win your next game. Have a great day, everybody.